Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
That's totally my fault because I muted when we went on a break. Thank you. Sorry about that.
I apologize for interrupting.
Thank you. No, that's totally
Thank
okay.
you.
Yes.
Thank you for letting me know. Okay, I'll let you know.
So I will just keep going from where I was. It's very important. It's national research study. It was done in 2018 and on a national level, and it found that serious violent crimes led to prosecution or conviction 70% of the time for people without disabilities. People with disabilities, 5%, only 5%. In other counties, victims with disabilities and sometimes even their attorneys on notice are not getting notified of hearings, are missing their opportunities to participate, despite having a right to notice, to be present, and to be heard. These rights violations are especially concerning, considering how victims are thrust into these systems after experiencing this trauma, a lack of control and inability to protect themselves or their surroundings. Sometimes the mere act itself leads to developing a mental health condition known as post-traumatic stress disorder, and not being heard by a court or by the state just exacerbates that harm and the trauma, and it adds new layers and a lack of sense of control. In at least 2 other counties, cases involving listed crimes wherein victims have additional rights are being resolved by prosecutors without notifying the victim or their attorney until after the fact, despite again the right to provide an opinion and to be heard. Courts in these cases aren't even asking about whether the victim was notified or consulted, even though the legislator explicitly provides the criminal justice system with the task of not causing further unnecessary trauma to the victims. These violations of statutory rights for victims, when there is no recourse to be had, does exactly that, re-traumatizes the victim. In one county, there is a case that is more than 5 years old and still has not been set for trial. The victim is fed up, tired, and just incredibly upset about the justice system, and has indicated to her attorney that she will not come forward should something like this happen again, and that she would just take matters into her own hands. This victim was also subjected to lengthy depositions, attempting to get in her medical records, and just to discredit her overall. More recently, with the ability to conduct hearings remotely, hearings are taking place before their scheduled time, links to courtrooms change at the last minute, when inadequate notice for everybody, victims, attorneys, and everybody's missing proceedings altogether. Sometimes parties, attorneys, prosecutors join the remote hearings without their camera on, which is concerning, especially for the parties under oath, because the court cannot review whether or not there are other people in the room or evaluate circumstances and the credibility of witnesses with a camera off. Throughout Vermont, victims' rights are not being adhered to nor enforced, and there is no structure for accountability. I have worked on many cases involving victims since when I have been at Disability Rights Vermont, and the impact that the current operations are having of people with disabilities, and particularly mental health conditions, is that people with disabilities don't trust the system. They are unlikely to report crimes perpetrated against them, and have experienced additional trauma from the system itself. Some of our clients are minors. Our youngest client, 4 years old, and she was molested sexually. These experiences will shape anyone's sense of justice indefinitely, and this creates a risk for future harm. Sadly, protective orders have similar issues, either in civil or family court. In family matters involving parents with disabilities, we're seeing an increase in the state's efforts to divide and separate families without making attempts to accommodate the parties, despite, again, the state law saying that the state must accommodate. This stigmatizations of parents with disabilities concern. Lastly, we would like to comment briefly on S36, a bill that by all appearances would have a disparate impact on people with mental health conditions, putting them on the other side of the criminal justice table as defendants, just because of disability-related behaviors. We believe that careful consideration into the language of this bill is extremely important. A lot of powerful testimony has been given by heroes in our communities doing incredibly difficult and invaluable work. I noticed that stories were told that involved brutal assaults and extreme threats, but everyone seemed to skip over the ability to arrest someone without a warrant for disorderly conduct, justifying an arrest without warrant for misdemeanors, including behavior that is unreasonably noisy or contains offensive language in public that interferes with medically necessary treatment. We believe it will unnecessarily and disproportionately harm individuals with mental health conditions in need of treatment, and it will have unwanted consequences for deterring people from seeking the mental health care they need. The current practices unfolding, particularly within the criminal justice system, and the proposed new legislation is creating a less safe Vermont, not a safer one. Victims' experiences of being overlooked and dismissed, and all this delay is causing a sense of helplessness and an unwillingness to seek help in the future. This new bill S36 will do the same thing if disorderly conduct is included. People with mental health conditions should not be afraid and should not shy away from getting the help they need, either from healthcare providers or from the courts. But this is the system we have created. I understand this committee might have wanted to hear more about transparency issues as it relates to the mental health conditions, but Disability Rights Vermont is available to comment more on these issues in the future, should the committee want to hear more from us. And I thank you all.
Thank you.
I just have a quick question, and maybe it's not you, but does Disability Rights Vermont also represent clients in discrimination cases, cases of housing discrimination, employment discrimination, et cetera?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I thought so, but I wanted to clarify.
Yes.
Any
Any questions?
other questions? Thank you. Did you have some comments you wanted to make, sir?
No, I'm just on the receiving end of some of the stuff that she talked to. Actually, my 36-year-old daughter is, and my daughter's 36. She can't walk, she can't talk. She was raped. And I found this out when she delivered a fetus, a 5-month-old fetus. The perpetrator had a sexual assault conviction, federal conviction for drug distribution in 1997. Judge Rainville saw it fit to release him back into the public under conditions. The 2 attorneys from the state's attorney's office in Chittenden County, as far as I'm concerned, should be fired for incompetence. I got audio of the hearing through Disability Rights Vermont. And anyone that would listen to that, if it was their daughter, would wonder why the judge was so eager to let this guy back on the street. He's out in public right now, having his first conviction was for raping a 13-year-old, but that's a Class C felony. It doesn't rise to the level of a Class A or Class B, which is why for the second charge, sexual assault, no consent, instead of aggravated sexual assault, because the first felony was a Class C felony. It wasn't a Class A or Class B felony. So the only reason he's walking right now, and I haven't hurt him, is he's my son-in-law. He got involved with my second daughter when she was 16, and he learned in jail that as long as I go after 16-year-olds, because no one would help me keep him away from her then, that no one's going to do anything. And my granddaughter, who's 11, loves her dad, doesn't know what he did. And that's the one thing that's holding me back from doing anything to him. And this is real. What she's saying, what she represents is real. And anyone that wants to talk to me further about any of this, I'd be glad. Chittenden County right now, all they care about is perpetrators. They give two craps about victims, especially disabled victims. The Coosie detective did his job because he thought he should be charged with sexual assault and sexual assault on a vulnerable adult. They didn't charge him with that because they said the maximum for that is 5 years. I'm not a lawyer, but I haven't had the chance to really dig into the law on that one yet, but I've asked the state's attorney's office to really look at that. So as a citizen, I don't understand at all. I don't understand how someone can rape a 13-year-old and a 33-year-old woman who cannot give consent, cannot do anything on her own, and that guy is allowed to walk the streets still to reoffend. And I'm going to be at the House hearing this afternoon. If I get a chance to talk, I'm going to give them the same message. Our system's broke, and in my county, it's really broke. I'm really disappointed Ted Kenny didn't win. I really am. Because I did 30 years in the military, and I would take a bullet for anybody in this room, even now, but I didn't sign up to be on the receiving end of this stuff. And the way the laws are being adjudicated or follow through. Whether I get held in contempt of court or not, I'm going to find Judge Rainville someday, and I want to ask him if that was his daughter, would he have released that guy? It's just wrong. So thank you it's impromptu, it's from the heart. And now what I'm dealing with, based on my military experience, I've gone back and I'm looking at all his convictions so I can help the state's attorney do their job better. What was he charged with? He violated conditions then. He fled. And if I don't do this homework and I just put my trust in that office, I'm going to be disappointed again. So I'm just letting you folks know it's my granddaughter's the only reason I haven't done anything really bad to him. And it's expecting a lot. My son is twice my size and has seen him twice at Costco. And the only credit I can give my former son-in-law is he saw my son, he looked away. But the responsible adult he's supposed to be with 24/7, except for work with his mother, and she stared my son down all the way in the store, trying to make things worse. I had to ask to have him come to court. We've been to every status conference in person. All this Zoom nonsense, there's something to be said when we're both there. And my satisfaction now is I know he's uncomfortable when he walks in that courtroom when we're there. And I can see that and I can feel that, because when you live with someone that's nonverbal for 36 years, there's a lot more that people are saying that doesn't come out of their mouth. And having people sit in court so that their victim can face them is really important. Not sitting behind a camera somewhere or at work like they did nothing, especially when they've done it twice that we know of. I don't know how many times my daughter got raped either. And someone might ask me, well, how did it happen? How did it get near her? Her sister was taking care of her for me. He worked at Coffee Cup at night. So any night my daughter was there, he wasn't around. And my daughter would make sure that she was always the last person that went to bed just to make sure her sister was safe. And when we were driving to the emergency room, she's crying and hysterical because she thought it was her fault. And my question to her was, did you see anybody do it, or did you know it happened? No. Then you're a victim in this just like I am, just like your sister is. And somebody took advantage. He took advantage. And had we backed up to when my daughter was 16, my second daughter, and someone would have helped me keep him away from her, I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now. I just don't understand at all. And what I also don't understand is I had 4 kids. I'm responsible for them until they were 18. They crashed my car, they do something, they don't get held accountable. I got held accountable along with them. So when he was on parole by the state, why is the state not culpable like a parent is when someone's on parole on conditions under their care. I don't know. I mean, I'm sorry. So
Appreciate your frustration and your anger. And
I'm not trying to take it out on you. I'm just like,
all I can say is thank you for being here. Thank you both for being here.
and I don't know if you remember, Mr. Sears,
Yeah.
but 9 years ago I was here because my nephew got murdered by his father, Sonny Schumacher, who was the Air Guard colonel. And then my sister went off the rails, you know, and had a mental meltdown. And you probably remember her being here. And it was her physically, but not her mentally. So I've had to deal with that in my life and not do anything to him after I heard he was beating on my sister. And now I sit with my own daughter and I'm about up to here with how the laws are executed and the police are doing their jobs. It's when we get to court and that part seems like we're failing.
Well, only thing I can say is, have you talked to the victim's advocate? Maybe it didn't know.
They're the one office that's done their job.
Pardon me?
They're the one office that's done their job. Armida Medic and Nitra up there, whenever I call, I ask, they're like, they get back to me, they call, they answer. Susan Harden's doing a good job, but she got handed this like halfway down the field. And these guys are doing a good job for me.
Unfortunately, we're moving on to
That's right.
Bill, but I appreciate.
Thanks for letting me share.
your frustration and your anger. And we hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for
I'm
being
glad to
here.
hear the victim's advocates are at least
They're doing a wonderful job. They really are. And they don't get compensated like the attorneys do.
no, that's a different story for a different day.
I understand.
Sorry for what happened to your family, but thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for what you guys do. But remember what she told you. Remember the story when you're dealing with things. Because I boil it down to this. If it was your sister, your mother, or your daughter, what would you expect? And every victim is one of those. So thanks.
We're gonna take up S14, related to justice for investment.
I don't know where anybody is.
I don't know either.
Ben's
Ben's
not
right here. Ben's right here.
Oh, Ben can't, okay. Dale is here. But Isaac's not here, and Erin's not here.
Oh, Dale Cook,
We, I think there's a group of people waiting outside.
then they can come in.
Okay. All right,
Where they are.
we're live.
There's the answer. Thanks, Matt. How are you?
Is this the rewrite?
Yeah.
Okay. We may not go over this today, but it's here.
And I should say it's unedited and there
Oh,
are
there you
some
are.
mistakes
I'm like,
or
where is
grammatical. Some words that don't belong there, so just
Okay,
ignore those, please.
ignore mistakes.
Yes.
See them.
As long as they're not substantive.
They won't be at the time of the bill.
But at least-
He did tell us.
Our first witness is Aaron Jacobson. Welcome back.
Why,
Happy
thank
New
you,
Year.
thank you, it's
We have
really
a new
nice to
committee.
see you.
So I'm gonna
Yes,
let everybody introduce themselves.
Great.
That's Senator Baruch right there.
He's invisible today.
One, Senator Baru. Nice to meet you, we talked over the phone, I don't know when.
6 years, Bennington County.
Oh, Tanya Bihovsky, Chittenden Central, sorry.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Bob North Spring County.
Sweet, Senator. Well, actually, I saw you in House Judiciary last year,
Last
right?
year, yeah.
That's great. Nice to see you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, you got promoted.
Uh-huh, I'll say.
Okay. We have a redraft, but you may be going on the old draft, which is fine.
Indeed I am, and I don't have a lot of testimony about too much of the language of either draft anyway. My understanding is mostly here to kind of answer a few questions or have a discussion around desistance. Do I understand that right?
I think so. That was-
Can you refresh our memory?
That was my recollection that we were waiting for that.
Okay, great. Well, then, good morning. And for the record, Erin Jacobson, Assistant Attorney General and Co-Director of our office's Community Justice Unit. So I am happy to talk about desistance. I find it to be a really exciting and potentially illuminating concept. I should note just briefly first, before I get started on that, although S14, the version I have, mentions both the Attorney General and our diversion programs, we don't actually at this time get JR2 monies. That could shift over time, maybe. We welcome JR2 monies. But I just wanted to note that I'm really here talking conceptually about desistance and not because we are directly going to be tasked with any reporting under S14, at least at this time, because we don't get those monies. So what is desistance? There's not necessarily one clear definition. And as well, the definition has certainly evolved over time. I recently caught a webinar in which one of the presenters noted that if you ask 10 lawmakers if they heard about recidivism or they understand what recidivism means, 8 will say yes. And if you ask the same group if they know what desistance is, 8 will say no. So although the term has been around a long time, it's really just recently that it's kind of coming to the fore in the rooms where people are crafting policy and where people are actually working in programs in the criminal justice system. The Office of Justice Programs at the Department of Justice defines desistance as, quote, the process by which criminality or the individual risk for antisocial conduct declines over the life course, generally after adolescence. And so one key word in that definition of desistance is really process. There is an old definition of desistance that used to really be more about a specific point in time at which an individual ages out of criminality entirely. But a more recent understanding of desistance recognizes that it is in fact a process. It's a stepping away from criminality that often correlates to aging out and brain development. But there's also an understanding that a lot of moving away from criminality has to do with other factors. So there's factors that can disrupt the desistance process, such as those that you might predict, like the loss of a job or the loss of housing. Incarceration can be a disruptor. Death of a loved one or the end of an important relationship, victimization, substance use, those kinds of factors that would derail any of us, right? Likewise, there are factors that contribute to desistance. And predictably, a lot of those are kind of the opposite of the negative factors. So access to secure housing and a secure source of food, employment, sobriety, social programs, and stable, meaningful relationships, in addition to simply getting older and maturing. So in contrast to desistance, which can really be viewed as a process, and which emphasizes positive progress away from crime, recidivism data really tends to be much more binary. An individual who commits another crime is therefore a recidivist. You're either a recidivist or you're not. So for example, somebody who is released from incarceration and then later they commit another crime, they would be called a recidivist. But that same individual, maybe they were incarcerated for aggravated assault they get out. A year later, they are caught possessing cocaine, and then 2 years after that, they're caught shoplifting. That is actually a process of desistance, because the length between the criminal activity is getting longer. And the crimes itself are becoming less and less serious. So you go from aggravated assault, which is a violent crime with a victim, to something like drug possession, which is a victimless crime, to then maybe something like shoplifting, which is just a very minor crime, likely not to be violent at all. And so the desistance analysis there is really important to understanding whether somebody is actually moving away from crime. And therefore, when you're talking about whether certain programs or social supports are working, you can't just look at the recidivism data and expect to have a good picture of the efficacy of the programs. That individual, under a recidivist analysis, would be a recidivist. DOC would have to count that person as a recidivist. They were incarcerated, then they got out and committed 2 more crimes. That doesn't look good for DOC under a recidivism analysis, but under a desistance analysis, it looks like an individual who's actually moving away from crime, and maybe some of the supports and programs they're getting are actually effective in helping them. Senator Biehoff.
I have a question, and you may not have the answer to it. I mean, this is really clear to me that this is sort of the human gray area in how we change over time. But my question in terms of recidivism, which again, this may not actually be a question for you, but it came up while you were talking, is an administrative violation of parole that is actually not another crime, but does put someone back, counted in recidivism data.
Is that counted?
Yeah, would that be considered, this is someone who's now recidivated?
Well, if that's a commission of a crime, then I think it could be a recidivism data point.
We did do, a few years ago, we did a definition of recidivism. And I don't remember exactly what that definition is, but
I can't recall the definition either, but I do know, like, a technical violation, for say a violation of parole, part of that definition is one that does not constitute a new crime.
Okay, so if someone misses or doesn't complete their treatment, and it wouldn't be a crime if they were not on probation or parole, it does not count towards recidivism data.
Yeah, it wasn't a
Okay.
new crime.
well, maybe you can help us out.
Yes, in statute, recidivism is defined as someone who spent more than a year in incarceration, who within 3 years was returned to DOC custody for at least 90 days.
Okay, so then it would count, because if someone violates on an administrative and they're returned to DOC custody, that then does count in spite of the fact that they in fact haven't committed a new crime.
If they were on parole, but if they were on furlough, it wouldn't, because they've never been released, technically.
So all of this reveals.
And the further complication too, it would be like, even in a revocation of parole, it would be if that revocation or suspension lasted longer than 90 days. So, because there are revocations and suspensions that do not.
The reason we did that, there is no national definition of recidivism. And if you ask some states, their recidivism rates are very low, because they just define it any way they want. So we spent a lot of time working with the then correction staff. I can't remember what date it was, but coming up with a definition of recidivism that would hopefully, it was based upon some of the national recommendations from the Justice Center, actually. And so that's where it all came from. There was a 50-state conference, and I think everybody but Hawaii was there, who went to meet on recidivism. And basically, some states could have a great recidivism rate because they just defined it in ways that would make them look good.
Or likewise, there's a study out of, there's a study out of
So
Pennsylvania DOC where they had a 90% recidivism rate.
Right.
Maybe that's not right. A very high recidivism rate, but then if you used desistance data to analyze what was happening, was actually 90% of those people you could say were desisting. They maybe hadn't gotten all the way there yet.
But I don't know that we ever defined desistance.
Right, and that's, I mean, the definition that I provided you is one definition, that it's how the Department of Justice defines it. But it's also that definition that, that the DOJ employs comes from a study that they did recently in 2021, taking a look at all of the different ways that people and scholars and policymakers define assistance in the literature, and that's the definition they came up with. So it is a fairly current definition based on how people who are thinking about assistance viewed assistance now and how it's defined. The other important part of that definition is it talks about not just stepping away from criminality, which might indicate that you're talking about a conviction, but also antisocial conduct. And so when you're looking at assistance, you might see signs that maybe someone needs some supports. Maybe they're not getting good access to some things they need. Maybe some things are working for them and some aren't. And so, you know, this is, I am not pretending to be the expert on this. I will say that the first time I heard about assistance was from people on the ground working in the diversion programs. In particular, the director of the St. Johnsbury Diversion Center brought this to Willa Farrell's attention, and then she shared it with me. And so I know in conversations with them that they've been thinking and talking about this for a long time. You know, why is everybody always talking about recidivism? I see a lot of kids that we're helping who are really doing well and moving away from crime, but the recidivism numbers don't indicate that. And so that's why I asked Eitan Nasreddin Longo, the chair of the RDAP that I also sit on, the Racial Disparities Advisory Panel, if he would consider suggesting that additional language in S14 that just says the report shall include any data related to reductions in recidivism or evidence of desistance. My intention was not to create obligations for programs to collect and analyze and report on desistance data, but more just to cue that desistance data can be really illuminating about the efficacy of programs. And if any program should want to collect it or has it, then that would certainly be something that could be helpful for you policymakers to hear about when you're considering how effective one program is or another.
Given, I appreciate that, and I just, given all the conversations we've had about wanting to move to a much more holistic system of supporting people, whether that be within DOC's buildings or in the community, and this measure really looks at both improvement over time and the needs someone might have for why they're not improving. To me, it feels like this is a much more holistic measure that takes into account the societal and economic and other external factors that tend to lead towards crime. So I actually feel like we should require this data collection, that it is it's a step moving us towards the DOC system that we are all talking about wanting.
I mean, that's a policy choice.
I know, I just putting that out there.
Well, but you have to define it.
Which is fine. I just, this to me feels like a much better data point that gives us so much more information about a whole person than recidivism.
And that data point also would, by its nature, have to reflect the person's point of view. I mean, it's going to, it will be challenging to collect accurate desistance data just from numbers. You can glean some information just from the recidivism numbers and other metrics that would relate. But really, you would probably have to survey individuals and say, what's going on here, what worked for you, what didn't. And I'm not suggesting that that's a bad thing to do anyway, but you know, you can kind of meld the quantitative and the qualitative data that way. You do start to get a much more holistic picture.
One, and a picture we can actually respond to. You know, when I hear testimony about people who have recidivated time after time after time after time after time, what that says to me is we're not meeting their needs. And if we don't understand what the needs are, we can't be 30s.
And when you mentioned time after time after time after time, in terms of recidivism data, the question I want to know is, what is each one of those times? Are they
Right.
are they spacing further apart? Are the crimes themselves getting less serious? And if not, that's important to know. And if so, that's important to know too.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
How are you?
I'm good. Nice to see you. How are you?
Thank you, Chair. Isaac Gano, Executive Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives with the Department of Corrections, for the record. I just want to quickly touch on recidivism. I think it is, as my colleague said, a noble goal to move towards that more expanded and granular definition. I think the Department of Corrections is fully in support of that, as Senator Paskey mentioned. Just for reference, the current recidivism number that we have now is 42.6%. Again, understanding the limitations of that definition. And I think what is remarkable, again, this is a 3-year look back, is that number has remained fairly constant for several years of data. And what that tells us is that when we consider the changing nature of the population who's incarcerated, as we presented, I believe, last week, you start to understand that even with a population of those who are incarcerated with higher risk scores of folks who have a higher proportion of serious felony charges, if that recidivism number stays constant, it's telling us that we are seeing progress. That even though folks are leaving the system with higher risk scores, if they're not being returned at greater numbers, that's a good sign. So we're seeing that even with that limited data point that we have there. Turning to the text, the amended text that we have here on S14, I just wanted to turn to the data assessment piece. Again, looking at here, that the report shall include an assessment of the impacts that JR2 expenditures and related initiatives had on crime and violence in the state, and whether those expenditures correlate to an increase or decrease of crime and violence and underlying explanations. A few points to make on that paragraph, if I may. The first, I think, is that the department fully endorses this greater understanding of crime and violence across the state. It is a subject, I think, that the executive branch is highly focused on, and a conversation Vermonters should be having. I wanted just to make sure it was something I think that we could accurately study. Again, I think we want to be careful about the causal nature. Here, I know we were talking about that correlation. It might perhaps be easier to look at individuals who have been served by JR2 programs. So, for example, went through the networks programming, and then to maybe narrow the scope of it to look at the outcomes for those individuals rather than to look at crime and violence across the entire state and whether JR2 is correlated with that. That might be just one suggestion that we would bring to the table. I think it's also important just to rewind to some of the goals of justice reinvestment generally as we have this conversation, which were to reduce recidivism and revocations to correctional settings, to achieve more equitable system across the board from race, gender, geography, to improve data reporting and decision making, and reinvest in policy implementation and those programs. But I did want to call out that those goals do not actually include looking at crime and violence across the state of Vermont. So just being thoughtful of perhaps a mission creep or scope creep here that we see in some of this text, but also to reiterate that I think this is a noble goal that we should be studying. I think I'll pause there. That's the high level. Any questions on that feedback?
Did Dale have anything to add to that? Dale Crook?
Dale, did you have any?
No, Isaac, I think you kind of hit the point. Understand you're trying to look at violent crime throughout the state and through JRI, and that really impacted a smaller sliver of the population. Our community supervision population is 4,000 people, and out of a statewide population of 600,000, it's not huge numbers. But I do think Isaac kind of hit the point. And following up with what the Attorney General's office was saying, desistance is kind of where we're going and what we've been trying to do for a while. It's really I define it as a reduction in the severity and the frequency of criminal and maladaptive thinking, right? And behaviors. I would ask that if you want us to track that, you would have to define what you would like us to track, because it's such a large concept. It would be understanding what you would want from that data set around desistance would be helpful for the department if we'd be able to get that information or not.
Certainly don't disagree that we should define that if we're gonna ask for it.
Yeah.
Well, Madam, for the record, Madam Grasky from the Office of Legislative Counsel, I guess in this unedited draft, this was an attempt to really synthesize the comments from the prior testimony about who were the custodians of certain information that could work together to provide it, and then also to break it down in a more categorical sense so that it was more easily defined and accessible. But the question that I thought of as I was drafting it was, to Isaac's point, is, are these initiatives all related really to justice reinvestment? Or is it sort of a broader sense of crime and violence within the state? And I think that's a policy choice that the committee needs to grapple with, as far as, is this data collection just going to be limited to justice reinvestment funds, in which case I would suggest that some of these categories need to be narrowed and further defined. Or is this something that's going to take a look at reporting the broader trends of crime and violence throughout the state? If that's the case, I think I would suggest that it would need to be detached from justice reinvestment as a whole.
As a devil's advocate, I think it should be the broader, because I think there could be specific subsets that would look at domestic violence, for example, and other places where we've done.
I agree with Senator Sears, and I'm wondering if we look at the broader picture of one of the sort of categories, can be the justice reinvestment stuff. So rather than it being all about justice reinvestment, it's a larger picture on crime in Vermont, and justice reinvestment is a part of it. Because I agree with Senator Sears that it makes sense to look at the bigger picture, and they are linked. The justice reinvestment should have an impact on the broader picture. So I would argue that they are linked.
One of the sad things about politics is we tend to take the news and blow it up into fact. And that's the trend. So is in fact violent crime up in Vermont? We should be able to look and see if that's the case. Is it a fact that we have policies that are allowing violent people to be out in our communities when they could be incarcerated on bail, for example? Is that a fact that, the problem in Chittenden County is the prosecutors letting people go? Is that a fact? And using anecdotal evidence, you might say yes. But if you had the evidence there, geographically, if you had the evidence statewide, you can then respond to that. That's what's been difficult, frankly, in my experience, is responding to people who were talking about catch and release in my community. So, but yeah, but this is the fact. we've increased the number of people on detention by over 100. So somebody's getting locked up who, who's on conditions release may have violated it, or who's not getting bail. So some people aren't getting released. But I don't have statistical evidence of that. I think that's the second thing this is trying to do is look at what was very difficult for the Justice Center was getting information. And, the Corrections Department and other agencies of state government did a terrific job, but that was combing through stuff. So hopefully, I think if we want to look at this again, we need the data, and accurate data can only help us to look at the reality of our situation and deal with problems.
One of the, I followed up with the Office of Racial Equity, and also I just had a conversation with Isaac prior to coming in about the data itself. I think there's still an open question out there over what data actually exists that can be collected and culled into a report like this. I think a lot of the data that is outlined in these various categories under subsection C, starting on page 2 and on page 3, may not all be obtainable, either because it isn't currently tracked, or maybe there are some antiquated systems, or there's some data sharing obstacles amongst and between departments and agencies, where specifically with last year with when it was Act 142 that created the Office of Racial Equity and their data collection and sharing authority, that they're still running into obstacles with certain agencies and departments turning over the information. And I can't speak to whether or not whether it exists or not, or just because they feel that it's not authorized under the statutes. So I think those are all things to consider, and a lot of these, if you look on later on in the subsection E and F about data sharing and confidentiality, this language is an attempt to try and overcome those obstacles, to really make it clear that this information absolutely needs to be shared in order to produce this report, and also that there are the confidentiality protections to ensure that everyone who's handling it respects it the right way. So I think those are all things that the committee needs to consider as far as obtaining the information and then categorizing it, organizing it in a way that can be reportable.
I feel like knowing whether the data exists or can be shared or what barriers to getting the data is actually really important, as we may need to create new requirements for data collection, but we don't know what we don't know. And so I wonder if there's a way to include in this report a description of these barriers. So a way of wording it that says, we want you to give us this data, but if it's not available, we want you to tell us why. So that in fact, we can circle back and make sure that we in fact are collecting the data that we need, and we in fact do have the appropriate sharing. Because I think so frequently we look at things and we're like, oh, we can't get that, and then sort of move on rather than really dig into like, why? How do we fix that? Like, I don't want to make it burdensome if the data doesn't exist, but I do want to know that the data doesn't exist.
Right, no, Senator, I appreciate that question, I think that point, and for example, on page 3, lines 9 and 10, about the status of individuals released from incarceration, including housing and job placement. I would look to jail. I know we wouldn't be able to tell you the housing of every single person who exits incarceration. I'm not sure who would be able to tell you that information, but good to know that perhaps we should be tracking it, that there should be some system. Obviously we have a rather balkanized framework of different community agencies who come together to provide these really critical services. But they don't all conduct data sharing, or perhaps it's a manual review of each individual and those collating all those individual files, which might be quite burdensome on state staff.
As I read reports, read data, I'm always struck by unknown. I mean, I can understand a small population, unknown race or gender or whatever. I was just reading it here. Data on line 11 on page 3, data elements, data required for certain subjects. Via this to include showing racial, gender, age, and income disparities available. But I'm always surprised at the high number of unknown that are any of those questions. So that also would be entered into.
I would suggest that hearing from the Office of Racial Equity, again, may be enlightening a little bit as far as some of the difficulties that they've
Could
encountered.
you work with Peggy on next week's agenda? Please, because we've scheduled that at 14,
At 10:30 on Wednesday.
but if there's people that we also need to hear from, that you should let Peggy know.
I mean, I could also try and just speak to Executive Director Davis a little bit more between now and then to get some more information, but I don't necessarily want to, you know, in any way misrepresent anything that she may say.
Well, it wouldn't hurt to have everybody involved here next Wednesday to deal with the redraft and we kind of go over it. But if he has particular comments, just have by next Wednesday. Just work with Peggy on the.
Okay.
And I'll invite all witnesses anyway, because it's worth it.
Okay, thank you all very much.